I was standing in line at an airport gift shop in Denver, half watching a rack of postcards, when I saw my husband walk past the window holding another woman's hand. The husband who filed for bankruptcy 14 months earlier. The husband who sat across from me at our kitchen table, sobbing, telling me we'd lost everything, and he couldn't live with the shame of it. The husband whose last words to me were a broken, apologetic voicemail before he disappeared completely. No note, no forwarding address, nothing. He looked directly at me through that gift shop window. And for 3 full seconds, he smiled at me the way you smile at a stranger you're vaguely trying to remember, before turning back to the woman beside him and continuing on toward his gate like nothing in the world was wrong. I didn't move. I didn't call his name. Every instinct in my body wanted to drop the water bottle I was holding, push past the people in line, and demand an explanation right there in the middle of a crowded terminal. But something colder and more careful took over instead. Some part of me that had spent 14 months learning how to survive without answers, and that part of me understood immediately that whatever I was looking at, I needed to understand it fully before I said a single word. I remember the specific, absurd details of that moment more clearly than almost anything else from the entire ordeal. The postcard rack in front of me had a photo of the Rocky Mountains at sunset. The cashier was asking the woman ahead of me if she wanted a bag for her gum. My connecting flight to Salt Lake City was boarding in 40 minutes. And somewhere behind me, my husband, a man I'd buried, in every meaningful sense, 14 months earlier, was walking through an airport terminal in a coat I didn't recognize, holding hands with a woman I'd never seen in my life. My name is Megan. I'm a physical therapist, which means I've spent my career teaching people how to rebuild strength after their bodies fail them in ways they never expected. I never imagined I'd need that same patience applied to my own life, piece by piece, after my husband disappeared. 14 months earlier, David sat me down at our kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening and told me, in a voice I'd never heard him use before, that his investment firm had collapsed, that a string of catastrophic personal trading decisions had wiped out nearly everything we had, and that he didn't know how he was going to face our kids, our friends, or himself. He cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the glass of water I brought him. He kept repeating the same phrase, over and over, almost like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I ruined everything. I ruined everything for all of us. I held him that night the way you hold someone you love through the worst moment of their life, never once questioning whether the moment itself was real. I remember stroking his back, telling him we'd figure it out together, that losing money wasn't the same as losing each other, that whatever happened, our family would survive it. I meant every word. I think in some strange way, that's exactly what made the performance so effective. I wasn't looking for a lie, because I genuinely believed nothing could be worse than watching someone you love fall apart in front of you. 3 weeks later, he told me he needed to take a short trip to sort out what remained of our accounts with a firm 2 states away. Something about liquidating the last salvageable assets before creditors could claim them. He kissed me goodbye at the door, promised he'd be back in 2 days, and I never saw him again after that morning. Not once. Not even a phone call, beyond a single voicemail 4 days later, his voice thick and apologetic, saying he was sorry, that he loved us, that he just couldn't face coming home and admitting how badly he'd failed us. I played that voicemail so many times in the weeks that followed that I eventually memorized every pause, every catch in his voice. I used to think I could hear real anguish in it. Looking back now, knowing what I know, I still can't decide whether that anguish was ever genuine or whether he'd simply gotten skilled enough at performing grief that even he couldn't tell the difference anymore. I spent the next year rebuilding a life out of the wreckage he left behind. I sold our house, the house we bought together 9 years earlier, the one with the swing set David built in the backyard the summer Ava turned 5. I moved Tyler and Ava into a smaller apartment across town, close enough that they could stay in the same school district, though it meant picking up extra shifts at the clinic just to cover the difference in rent. There were months where I worked 6 days a week, coming home exhausted enough that I'd fall asleep on the couch before I finished helping Tyler with his homework. I explained to a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old, in the most careful, age-appropriate language I could manage, that their father had made some very serious mistakes, that he loved them, and that none of what happened was their fault. Ava, only 8 at the time, used to ask me almost weekly whether Daddy was okay, wherever he was, whether he was eating enough, whether he was cold. Tyler asked fewer questions out loud. But I watched him grow quieter over those months, more guarded, the kind of quiet that worried me more than any amount of crying would have. I believed every word of the explanation I gave them myself at the time. I had no reason not to. I grieved David the way you grieve someone who's still alive, but permanently gone, attending a version of mourning with no funeral, no closure, just an empty side of the bed and a stack of unopened bills that used to have his name on half of them. So when I saw him walking through that Denver airport alive, well-dressed, holding another woman's hand like he'd built an entirely new life somewhere none of us existed, the wreckage of the last 14 months didn't just come rushing back. It rearranged itself completely, all at once, into a shape I didn't recognize. I didn't chase him through the terminal. I stood frozen for a moment, watching him disappear toward a different gate. And then I did the only thing that felt like it might actually matter. I pulled out my phone and took a photo, quick and discreet, of him and the woman before they moved too far to capture clearly. I called Grace that same night, the moment I landed back home. Grace is David's sister, a nurse, someone I'd stayed close with even through the worst of the collapse and disappearance, mostly because she seemed as blindsided by all of it as I was. I sent her the photo before she even finished saying hello. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, longer than made sense for someone simply confirming what her brother looked like. "Megan," she finally said, her voice careful in a way that immediately told me something was wrong. "I need to tell you something I probably should have told you a long time ago." "Grace, what is it?" "About a month before everything happened," she said, "before he sat you down at that table, he texted me something strange. I didn't think much of it at the time. I honestly forgot about it for a while, until I saw this photo just now." "What did it say?" She was quiet for a moment before she read it back to me, apparently having kept the message all this time. He said, "Sometimes I think about just starting over somewhere no one could find me. A clean break. No explanations to anyone." I told him that sounded like burnout talking, that everyone thinks about running away when work gets stressful. He said I was probably right and dropped it. I never brought it up again. I didn't think it meant anything. I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up, turning it over, feeling something harden in my chest that hadn't been there 14 months earlier. Grief has a certain shape to it. This wasn't that shape anymore. I asked Grace, quietly, why she'd never mentioned it before, even after he disappeared. She admitted she felt guilty even considering it might mean something, like suspecting her own brother of premeditation was its own kind of betrayal. I told her I understood, though some small part of me couldn't help wondering what those 14 months might have looked like if she'd said something sooner. I didn't confront him. I didn't even know yet exactly what I'd be confronting him about. Instead, I hired a private investigator, a quiet, methodical woman named Patricia Sandoval, and asked her to find out, discreetly, exactly who David was living as in Denver and exactly what his life looked like now. It took her 12 days to send me a report that changed everything a second time. David was living under the name David Ferris. He built an entire professional identity around it, working at a private wealth management firm not far from where I'd seen him, doing essentially the same kind of work he'd claimed to have catastrophically failed at back home. He was engaged. Her name was Claire Whitfield, a local real estate agent, and as far as Patricia's research could tell, Claire had absolutely no idea any version of his previous life existed at all. The report included photographs. David at what looked like a company holiday party, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since our own wedding. David and Claire at what appeared to be an engagement dinner, her hand extended to show off a ring that looked disturbingly similar in style to the one he'd given me 9 years earlier. A social media post from Claire, captioned with something about finally finding the right person. A comment section full of well wishes from people who had no idea they were celebrating a lie. I read that report 3 times before I could fully absorb it. The man who told me, sobbing, that he'd lost everything and couldn't face his own family out of shame, had actually rebuilt an entire career in the exact field he claimed to have destroyed, under a new name, with a new fiancée, roughly 14 months after walking out our front door. He hadn't just survived his supposed ruin. He'd thrived in it comfortably, in a life that looked, from every angle Patricia's photographs captured, genuinely happy. Patricia's report had one more detail buried near the end that reframed the entire story a third time. In the course of researching David's professional background, she'd found records suggesting his original firm had flagged irregularities in his trading accounts almost 2 months before his public collapse. Internal audit flags, the kind that typically precede a formal fraud investigation. The collapse hadn't just been personal financial ruin. It may have been staged specifically to escape scrutiny that was already closing in on him. I called Patricia back that same evening, needing to hear her walk me through it out loud, rather than just reading it silently off a page. "Are you telling me this was never really about losing money at all?" I asked her. "I can't say for certain yet," she said carefully. "But the timeline is suspicious enough that I'd recommend taking this to law enforcement rather than continuing privately. This is starting to look like something bigger than a runaway husband, Mrs. Foster." That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a betrayed wife's private grief and started thinking of it as something that needed real legal authority behind it. I brought everything to a detective named Renee Castillo, who specializes in financial fraud cases. I remember sitting across from her desk, sliding the photo and Patricia's report toward her, feeling strangely calm considering how much my hands had been shaking just 2 weeks earlier. Castillo went quiet for a moment after reviewing everything, flipping back through pages, cross-referencing dates against something on her own computer screen. Then she said something that genuinely surprised me. "Mrs. Foster, I need to tell you something. Your husband's original firm filed a fraud complaint almost 14 months ago. It's been sitting cold in our system because we had no current location for him. What you've just handed me is the piece we've been missing." I sat there for a moment, absorbing that. So this wasn't just my situation. He was already being investigated before he ever staged the collapse. "It looks that way," Castillo said, "which changes things significantly. This isn't just an abandonment case anymore, if it ever really was one. This is an active, multi-state financial fraud investigation, and you've just given us his location, his current identity, and a photograph confirming both. I wasn't the beginning of this investigation. I was the missing link that reopened it." Castillo explained, over the following weeks, exactly what her team had already suspected before I ever walked through her door. David had been quietly diverting client funds into personal accounts for well over a year before his staged collapse, slowly building a private financial reserve substantial enough to disappear comfortably and start over somewhere entirely new. The public loss of everything wasn't ruin at all. It was cover, a convincing, devastating performance designed to explain his disappearance without anyone looking too closely at where the actual money had gone. The number, once fully reconstructed by forensic accountants working the case, was staggering. Client funds diverted over that year totaled well into 7 figures. Our family's remaining savings, the ones he claimed had evaporated in catastrophic trading losses, had simply been moved, quietly, into accounts that eventually funded his new life in Denver, his new apartment, his new engagement ring for Claire, his new car, all of it paid for with money that was never actually lost at all. How does someone move that much money without anyone noticing for over a year? I asked Castillo during one of our meetings. "Slowly," she said, "a little at a time, across dozens of small transactions, structured specifically to stay under the thresholds that trigger automatic review. It takes patience and a fairly sophisticated understanding of how those reviews work. Your husband clearly had both." Castillo and I made a decision together at that point that mirrored, in its own way, the same restraint I'd shown in that airport terminal weeks earlier. We agreed not to approach David directly, not yet. Tipping him off before Colorado authorities could coordinate a proper arrest risked losing him entirely, risked him disappearing a second time with whatever resources he had left. So we waited carefully while the investigation moved into place, coordinating across state lines, building a case airtight enough that there would be no room for him to talk his way free once it finally closed. Claire Whitfield was contacted directly by Castillo's team about 10 days into that process. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, understandably, but Castillo told me afterward how it went. Claire was informed, as gently as that kind of information can possibly be delivered, that her fiancé was living under a false identity, that he was already legally married with 2 children, and that he was the subject of an active, multi-state fraud investigation. Castillo said Claire went completely silent for almost a full minute after hearing it, then asked to see proof, understandably, before she'd believe a word of it. They showed her copies of our marriage certificate, Tyler and Ava's birth certificates, and a comparison of David's real driver's license photo against the one under his assumed name. Only then did she start to cry, according to Castillo, not the composed tears of someone processing bad news, but something closer to a complete collapse of everything she thought she understood about her own life. I've since spoken with Claire myself more than once, and I believe completely that she had no idea. She described the same charming, meticulous, endlessly reassuring man I'd fallen in love with over a decade earlier, the same person who'd apparently found some formula for convincingly reconstructing his entire life not once, but twice. Claire's devastation was its own kind of collapse, parallel to mine, just 14 months delayed. He told me he'd never been married, she said, the first time we spoke on the phone, her voice still raw even weeks after finding out. He said he'd always wanted kids, but it just never happened for him. I used to feel sorry for him about that. She paused for a long time. I'm so sorry, Megan. I had no idea any of you existed. I told her the same thing I still believe now, that she owed me no apology at all, that she was exactly as deceived as I had been, just on a different timeline. It was strange, comforting in a way I hadn't expected, to speak with the one other person on earth who understood precisely what it felt like to have an entire relationship revealed as something other than what you believed it was. What struck me most was how quickly Claire chose to cooperate once the truth was laid out for her. She handed over financial records, correspondence, details of David's current life, and routines that strengthened the case significantly. Text messages where he described, in vague terms, needing a fresh start and leaving complicated things behind him, phrases that, read now with full context, sound chillingly literal rather than metaphorical. I think some part of her needed to be useful in that moment, needed some way to convert the wreckage of her own relationship into something that actually mattered. The arrest happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, at David's office in Denver, quiet and procedural, no chase, no dramatic scene. Castillo called me the moment it was confirmed. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, waiting to feel some enormous wave of relief or vindication, and instead just feeling a strange, quiet stillness, like a held breath finally released after 14 months. I was eventually allowed to review portions of his post-arrest interview, part of the broader case file, once the legal process moved forward. Listening to him explain himself was, in its own way, more disturbing than anything else in this entire ordeal. He described feeling trapped by both the closing fraud investigation and a marriage he said he'd outgrown, and that staging the collapse and disappearing felt, in his own words, like the cleanest way out of both situations at once. Cleanest. That was the word he used. Not cruelest, not most cowardly. Cleanest. Like abandoning his wife and 2 children was simply the most efficient item on a checklist he'd been quietly working through for over a year. Explaining the full truth to Tyler and Ava was, without question, the hardest part of all of this. They'd already spent 14 months grieving one version of their father's absence, a father who'd supposedly failed catastrophically and couldn't face them out of shame. Now I had to explain an entirely different, more complicated truth. That their father hadn't been destroyed by failure at all, that he built a new life on purpose, under a new name, and simply decided they weren't part of the version of himself he wanted to keep. I sat them both down at our kitchen table, the same kind of setting David had once used to deliver his own devastating performance, though I made sure to tell them the truth as plainly and gently as I could manage. Ava, 10 by then, mostly just cried, asking over and over whether this meant Daddy had never really loved them at all. Tyler, 13, sat very still through most of it, his jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of David's own composure whenever he was trying not to show emotion. Tyler asked me one question that I still think about constantly. Did he ever actually love us, or was that fake too? I told him the truth as best I understood it myself. that I believe David loved them in whatever limited way he was capable of loving anyone, but that loving someone and being willing to sacrifice anything for them are two very different things, and his father had shown us, clearly, which one he was actually capable of. Ava asked if she'd get to see him again someday. I told her that was possible eventually once the legal process settled and if he wanted that relationship, but that it would happen on terms that protected her, not terms that served whatever he needed from the visit. I still don't know exactly how that will look in the years ahead, and I've stopped pretending I have a clean answer ready for every question they'll eventually ask. With David's assets frozen as part of the ongoing fraud case, my attorney began the long process of pursuing restitution, both for our family and for the clients whose funds had been diverted over that year. It's slow, unglamorous work, the kind that doesn't resolve in a single dramatic court date, but in a series of filings and hearings spread out over what will likely be another year or more. Some of what he took will probably never be fully recovered. I've made peace, as much as I can, with that reality. Claire and I still talk occasionally, months later. It's a strange, cautious kind of connection. Two women who built completely different versions of a life with the same man, both of us discovering, at very different points, that neither version had ever been entirely real. We don't talk often, and when we do, it's mostly practical, updates on the case, occasionally just checking in on how the other is holding up. But there's a specific kind of understanding between us that I don't think either of us could find anywhere else, and I'm grateful for it, even given everything that led us here. Grace has become a more present, active aunt to Tyler and Ava since all of this came out, in a way she wasn't before. I think she still carries some guilt over not mentioning that cryptic text sooner, even though I've told her, repeatedly, that I don't blame her for it. She shows up now, consistently, for school events and weekend visits, in a way that feels like her own quiet way of making up for a silence she still regrets. I think about that airport moment often, the sheer, improbable coincidence of it. One connecting flight, one gift shop line, one brief window of visibility between two lives that were never supposed to intersect again. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't seen him that day. Maybe nothing. Maybe he'd still be living comfortably under a new name, engaged to someone who deserved better than the lie she was given, while our family kept believing he'd been destroyed by shame rather than simply choosing to leave. What I've settled into a year past his arrest isn't bitterness, even though I think I'd be entitled to plenty of it. It's something closer to clarity. I spent 14 months grieving a man I believed had loved us enough to be devastated by failing us. What I learned instead was that he'd simply found what he considered the most efficient exit available and executed it without much apparent concern for what it would cost the people he left behind. I've chosen, deliberately, to teach Tyler and Ava resilience rather than bitterness from all of this, though I won't pretend that choice comes easily every single day. Some mornings I still catch myself replaying that voicemail in my head, the broken apology I once found so convincing, and I have to consciously remind myself that grief for a version of him that never really existed isn't grief I owe anyone, least of all myself. They're both doing well, better than I expected given everything they've absorbed over these past 2 years. Tyler's taken up running, long solitary miles most mornings before school, something he started the same month David was arrested and never stopped. He told me once it's the only time he doesn't think about any of it. Ava's thrown herself into art in a way that feels like her own version of processing something too big for words, yet her sketchbooks are full of houses, oddly enough, dozens of them, different shapes and sizes, like she's still working out what home is supposed to mean. I still work full-time at the clinic, though I've dropped back to a schedule that actually lets me be present for both of them most evenings, now that the extra shifts aren't quite as necessary. The restitution process moves slowly, filing by filing, but Castillo tells me the case against David is about as solid as fraud cases get, thanks in large part to Claire's cooperation and the financial trail Patricia first uncovered in that 12-day report. I don't know what David's life looks like now, behind whatever walls he's currently living behind. I've stopped wondering, mostly. The version of him I spent a decade loving was, I've come to understand, at least partly a performance all along. Maybe not every moment of it, but enough of it that I can no longer tell where the real man ends and the convincing one begins. I've decided that distinction isn't actually mine to solve anymore. It's his, if he ever cares to sit with it honestly, which I suspect he won't. He staged an entire collapse just to disappear cleanly, and the only thing he never planned for was how much stronger everyone he left behind would become without him.